I love career mode, but it's so easy for your save to get boring, unrealistic, or sometimes even both. It's especially true for Road to Glory saves, despite them being one of the few things that EA actually gets right in this game. Most of the time, they're still difficult enough to be fun, and way less time consuming than doing one in a game like Football Manager. The only real issue is trying to keep them realistic. Today, I've looked at some real-life Road to Glories from Luton, Brighton, Wigan and Brentford, and also some of my favourite Road to Glories I've ever done, to try and find some tips to help you make your next save even more memorable. Okay, let's start with the most important part of career mode: fun. Of course, fun is a very subjective thing, but most of the time, it's just repeating the same things over and over again that can turn the most fun save in the world into a pretty standard boring one. I really recommend that you try and change at least one part of your career mode every single season. It could be something as easy as changing your tactics, or scouting different youth nations, or maybe changing clubs while trying to follow the official league rules. They sound like tiny changes, but they do really help make your save more fun and also can be done in a realistic way. Wigan are actually a really cool example of something you could try to follow. Throughout their rise to the Premier League, they had a very English core. You could see things change as soon as they got to the top flight though. All of a sudden they had an Ecuadorian Antonio Valencia, a Senegalese Henry Camara, Honduran Wilson Palacios, and also a Colombian Hugo Rodallega. These are probably the players that you remember the most from this Wigan team, and I mean, I've totally forgotten that people like Michael Brown and Chris Kirkland even existed. Making this kind of change would be a super fun way to keep your Road to Glory fresh. You could do something like giving yourself one extra nation you can sign players from for every season you play. Maybe start out with just England, in Season 2 you add Wales, in Season 3 Egypt or Brazil. It would be a really fun little twist to have a Road to Glory side with some really bizarre nations in it, and it would definitely help you to keep your squad feeling fresh. You might be thinking, how is this going to help me keep my save realistic? Well, actually, the recent changes to rules in England mean that basically any international player on FIFA is actually eligible to join any English team on the game. It's similar in Germany, where the EU rules are slightly more relaxed than the ones that England use. You could also use something similar to this for your academy, which is also by far one of the hardest things to keep realistic. You could do something like change the nation that you're scouting every 3 months, every 6 months, or every 9 months, depending on how random you want your squad to end up looking. I always think that the academy is one of the hardest things to keep realistic, but also one of the easiest things to keep fun. Of course, depending on which club you're at, certain clubs are always going to be better than others when it comes to bringing through young players. It might be the region of the country that they find themselves in, it could be the philosophy of the board or the director of football in charge of the club, or it could just be tradition that the club has always done things in a certain way. Annoyingly, none of this is actually really represented inside career mode, except certain clubs getting slightly harder objectives. The academy is actually really hard to keep realistic, mainly because how fast younger players can grow inside the game mode. You can kind of keep it a little bit more realistic if you do restrict the amount of scouts that you use. In fact, I would say 2-star scouts is absolutely the most realistic choice, even if you're playing as someone like Manchester United or Barcelona. If you're playing as someone like Burton Albion or Barrow that's never really had a superstar come through their club, then definitely a 1-star scout is going to be realistic even when you get to the Premier League. Some teams just aren't really meant to have academies, and that's totally okay. A 1-star scout will still produce some good players, but maybe only 1 or 2 every single season, rather than a dozen that some of the better scouts will be finding. This does restrict some of the fun of finding a new wonder kid, but it does also make your saves a lot more realistic, and I do think having a bit more realism can also increase the fun long term. It can also be fun to go to Transfermarkt and have a look at some of the nationalities that a certain club has brought through their academy in the past. I know I've done this on some of my older saves, and this is where our comparison to Brentford can actually come in. They progressed from League 1 to the Championship with an academy, but got rid of it as soon as they got to the 2nd division. Instead of having an academy, they brought through a series of young Danish players who had either been released from bigger clubs or were looking promising at smaller Danish teams. If you look at some of the players that have come through at the club you want to use and you notice a pattern, you could definitely follow this Brentford model. Let's say that your team brings in a lot of Irish players. You could go and sign players from the Irish League, or you could look at bigger teams like Arsenal, Manchester United and Chelsea and see if they've released any of their Irish youth players at the end of every season. Even the very worst players at some of these Premier League academies inside career mode are actually going to be about 68 rated, and that's more than good enough for a spot even in a Championship starting 11. This can be fun when you're using nations like Denmark and Ireland, but it becomes even more fun and more interesting in my opinion if you notice a pattern from an obscure nation. I can give an example here of when Portsmouth were in the Premier League, they signed a lot of players from Nigeria and Ghana, while Salford have signed a few players from Jamaica and other Caribbean nations. The game database has a ton of Jamaicans in it and a ton of Nigerians, so if you're playing as a smaller club and you see something like this, it can actually make your save a lot more interesting and also borderline more realistic. Of course, signing players from any nation is always going to be an important part of your road to glory, and that means that squad planning is also going to be crucial, and it's an important way to keep the save fun and realistic. It could always be very tempting to sign 25 high potential young players from Premier League teams in Season 1 and keep the entire squad together all the way up to the Premier League. Realistically though, only about 2/3 of your team will stay every time you get promoted. If you stay in the league, then I would say this goes up to about 80%. This means that a promotion should see about 10 players join your squad and another 10 leave, while if you don't get promoted, then I would say you'll probably see 4 or 5 coming in and going out. Only a very small amount of players have actually made the step up multiple times. Luton's Ruddock Panzu is by far the most famous for this at the minute. He's been promoted 4 times with Luton. But you might not know Lewis Dunk at Brighton and Wigan's Leighton Baines. They both got promoted 3 times. They got promoted Championship to Premier League, League 1 to the Championship, and League 2 to League 1. I guess this proves that it isn't unrealistic to keep a couple of players for the entire journey, but I would probably limit myself to a maximum of 2 players if you do want to keep things a little bit more realistic. Especially with how high potentials are in young players, this shouldn't be too hard for you to do. The players will grow at a similar rate to the club, and you should have a couple of people making the entire journey. One thing that's never hard to do inside career mode is signing a new player. If you play on loose transfer restrictions, you can sign Messi in League 2 if you have enough money. If you're playing on strict transfer restrictions, then you'll have a pretty tough time signing basically anyone once you get to the Premier League. This is where EA really needs to put in a middle ground, and we can kind of actually simulate that by using Delegate on almost every transfer we make. It's a little bit more realistic to do it this way because very few managers are going to travel around the country, especially in League 2, negotiating deals. Instead, you can let one of your scouts, your assistant manager, or your director of football do it instead. I like how this makes the transfer take a little bit longer. It's always annoyed me that you can fully sign a player, do the entire process in the same day, and by delegating this adds on a few extra days to the process. It can also give you the chance of having your transfer fail, and it removes some of the ridiculous player exchange transfer offers that the AI will suggest that can be quite hard to resist. I think the risk of transfers failing is also a good way to keep the game a little bit more fun. I can give an example of one of my former career modes where my third choice option was a young left back called Jordan Amavi. On FIFA 15 he was highly rated but nowhere near as good as my first choice option, which was Terence Kongolo. Amavi is still one of my favourite players of all time because I had a bid for Kongolo rejected nearly 10 years ago. I still have some warmth towards him. Maybe you'll get the same feeling in your next save. I know I really hope you do because everyone's heart has a space for a Jordan Amavi. If you've got any suggestions for things that you think people need to do to keep things more fun or realistic, please do leave them in the comments below. And if you like this video and want to see more FIFA content, subscribe and check out the playlist on screen right now. But thanks for watching, I'll see you soon. Cheers and goodbye.